Welcome to our UCLA Alumni Association Town Hall. I am your UCLA Alumni Association President, D'Artagnan Scorza, and I'm incredibly grateful to be here with all of you tonight. Each week, we're back this fall, and each month we bring to you updates about our incredible university, as well as talk about topics that are of interest to our alumni community, as well as our campus community and the world. We're incredibly excited to have with us two guests tonight. Both UCLA's Administrative Vice Chancellor, Michael Beck, and Megan McEvoy is a professor in the Institute of Society and Genetics and the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Molecular Genetics. And they're joining us tonight to talk about our campus updates and what's happening with us today. You know, we started this series about a year ago to gather our alumni around the world and to share our UCLA updates as well as discuss issues of interest. And I just want to thank you all so much for the feedback you provided on this fantastic series. And just know that we like to hear from you about what you'd like to discuss and what you'd like to learn more about here at our campus. So when we begin this year, this 2021, after having dealt with this past year and a half and the pandemic, and one of the things that we just want to acknowledge and thank our UCLA colleagues for is the hard work they've engaged in to help bring us back. Our students, faculty, and staff have returned to Westwood, and tonight we're going to talk about their return to campus and how that's going for our Bruin community. So again, I'd like to welcome our special guests, Michael Beck, our UCLA Administrative Vice Chancellor, and Megan McEvoy, our professor in the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Molecular Genetics. And they both serve today as the co-chairs of UCLA's COVID-19 Response and Recovery Taskforce. I want to welcome and thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Dart. We're pleased to be here.
Such a pleasure. Thank you so much. So, Michael, could you begin by providing us an update? We want to talk about what it's been like to return to campus, and I think you have some information to share with us. Is that right?
Yes, thank you. I'll go through a quick PowerPoint, and then Megan will sort of complete bring it to a close, and then we'll go to Q&A and finish with the program. So real quickly, this gives you a sense of sort of where our current cases are over the last 4 weeks. And so last week we were down to about 25 new cases on the campus, and that's down from a high of 374 cases that the week ending January 15th. So you can see that we're in a much different position. We unfortunately have had 5 deaths associated with COVID during the pandemic period. This graph gives you a really sort of better picture of the positive cases per day. And you can see here in the end of November through really the end of January, in the last year period was really where we were spiking, consistent with what was happening in LA County and the rest of the country. So a number of mitigations that we put in place to help get us to the point in which we're at today, which is to be able to bring really all of our students back to campus and most of our employees in an effort to facilitate a more consistent learning environment for our students. And when I showed the previous graph and we show the spikes, remember, we were not offering in-person instruction during that time, and the dorms did not really were only available for a very, very small number of individuals, a couple hundred people who had nowhere else to live. So when we look at the different mitigations, one is a vaccination requirement that everybody who's sort of living, learning, or working on campus is required to be fully vaccinated or obtain a medical or religious exemption or deferral if they're pregnant. And this graph shows you the percentage of that population that's actually fully vaccinated. And the campus and faculty staff numbers are relatively low because we're not showing you in this graph are the number of employees that are working fully remotely that are not required to be fully vaccinated, or individuals that are partially vaccinated as they're going through the waiting period for the second vaccine. So it's really a very a strong response to the vaccination requirement. And as a result, the campus really is creating a relatively sort of independent bubble, if you want to say, around the campus associated with sort of herd immunity. And also note that last year and this year, faculty, staff, and students are also required to receive the annual flu vaccine. Other things we're doing is surveillance testing across the campus. We've provided just under 500,000 tests since November of 2020, and we offered just under 18,000 tests last week that were provided. And these are available all across the campus through a vending machine. So all students, faculty, and staff are able to go to vending machine, get a free test kit, and drop it off, and then the results are rendered within, usually within about 24 hours. We've had a total of about almost 2,000 positive cases identified through our surveillance program. And of the 25 cases last week, 9 of them were through the surveillance program. And those that are unvaccinated that are on the campus, with exceptions, they're allowed to be on the campus, and then they are required to test twice a week. Everybody else is it's just recommended for them to test once a week if they so choose. Wastewater testing within all of our undergraduate housing facilities, both our off-campus apartment facilities and all of our dorms. And this is really exciting how this works. So if they detect, so when we do the testing, if they detect the wastewater stream from a specific building that has a positive, then we immediately go and test everybody within those buildings, within that specific building, to identify the positive case so they can be put into isolation, and any close contacts can put into quarantine before we end up with a greater potential spread throughout the dorm environment. And because we're primarily triples in the dorm, very tight environment, so this is very helpful. And then as a result, the graph shows the test positivity, both blue, dark blue is UCLA, and then red is LA County and California. And you can see where UCLA, once we got sort of past the peaks, that we are in a very positive environment with a test positivity rate of 0.06% during the last week. Other mitigations are really required to wear masks anywhere indoors. This is a LA County requirement, except for when one is eating and drinking. And then we have also undertakes a ventilation system assessment across the entire campus. And so every classroom and building space was assessed over particularly over the last 6 months or so. And any building or space that doesn't meet the requirement of, it's called an ASHRAE requirement, then a portable air filtration system is installed into the classroom. And what I'm showing here is actually all of this is available online to the campus community. So if you're unsure about whether your specific classroom or your office space actually meets the standard, you just go to the website and you identify the building, the floor number. In this case, this is my office, and it shows that a air filtration system portable air filter was required for my space, and the status of that was already delivered. And the other status actions could show that there was an attempted delivery that they couldn't deliver, or that one is scheduled for delivery, or somebody needs to make an appointment. And then people can also put in an order. The other is a daily symptom monitoring survey, which faculty, staff, and students on the campus are required to complete every day. It assesses whether or not they have any symptoms, and if so, directs them to contact our exposure management team in an effort to get instructions, usually to be tested, potentially be put into isolation. And so there's a number of activities in which people need to be cleared. And so we built this mobile app that allows people to show their clearance certificate at events or other access points if they're going to the library or the recreation center. And we'll also be establishing, using the same app for whether or not individuals are cleared to go to campus restaurants, recreation facilities, the museum, the Rose Bowl, Poly Pavilion, because under the current requirements for City of LA and the county is that only individuals that are vaccinated or those individuals that are have an exception have tested within the last 72 hours. And instead of having to have the campus population bring around all their paperwork all the time, the app does this for them, and it checks whether they've been doing the testing through our program at the right time. The other elements of this are, it allows you to do the symptom monitoring on the symptom monitoring survey from the app. It also allows supervisors and faculty to go to the app to see if their employees or their students were actually cleared to be in the classroom or in the work environment that day, and that's a live feed, so that's working very well. And this is what it really looks, this is sort of the supervisor portal, and it shows you that the individual employees assigned to you, whether they're cleared, whether they have a masking requirement, which everybody on the campus currently has a masking requirement for indoors. If they're fully remote, meaning which we don't expect them to be to campus, whether they're compliant with the vaccine policy, meaning which doesn't necessarily mean they're vaccinated, just means they've been vaccinated or they've applied or received an exception. And then another column that'll be added will be whether or not they're compliant with the testing obligations if they're supposed to do it. We also prepared for recognizing the fact that we house over 20,000 students, that we need to be able to provide isolation and quarantine space outside of their congested dorm and apartment environment. So we've set aside nearly 500 beds across our inventory between the guest house and should be evergreen, the dormitory, so that has primarily single rooms, so that we can accommodate their isolation and quarantine. This shows you what happens over the last 4 weeks. And so you can see that, again, very positive data. We've had, over the last 4 weeks, we've had a high of 20 people associated in isolation and quarantine. And then the last week, it's down to 6 individuals. We've also created a pivot plan and published the decision matrix associated when we should make changes to the existing conditions. So if in fact case rates worsen, or on the campus or in the county, or other specific criteria are changed, we would then look to either ramp down the campus operations and in-person instruction, or potentially be able to ramp it back up. And so this was developed so that everybody knew how the decisions would be made and what the criteria associated with that. And then developing really a flex work program that should go well beyond the COVID period. And it really creates an opportunity for people to work on site, work remotely, or work in a hybrid fashion in which they have a split schedule, working on campus at a period of time and remotely other days of the week. Or it could be a 980 schedule or a 410 schedule or a 312 schedule that's part of the new environment. And during the last 18 months, the survey feedback has shown that productivity has been really well maintained, technology tools have been used effectively, and employees have demonstrated sort of their resilience with the changing modalities of work, and that the outcome is that the flexibility with work-life balance has significantly benefited many of the employees. And I had a graph that I missed that I showed you, but it's about 90% of the employees through their manager have, or their manager's interpretation of the work is that 90% of the employees that are working remotely are either more productive or as productive as they were working in person. So it's demonstrating that's actually working effectively. Now I'm going to quickly turn to Megan to provide you an overview of the winter planning.
Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to have the invitation to be here tonight. And as Michael mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about winter planning. I'll talk from an instructional perspective. I'll tell you a little bit of the history about what went into fall planning, because we have some lessons learned from what we did in the fall that we can look forward to in the winter. But the good news is that for winter instruction, what we're planning to go forward with is primarily in-person instruction. And this reflects the fact that we have such low case rates right now. It makes sense to bring back our students in in-person classes even further. We don't have any class size limitations because we don't have classroom density restrictions or physical distancing requirements. So we're able to use our available classrooms as fully as we can. We probably will still have some remote classes. That is still being worked out exactly how many we will have. But we've learned to manage some of these things, I think, in a very flexible sort of way. What we might have, for example, is a remote lecture that has discussion sections. So even if there's a primary lecture class, a big lecture class that's taught remotely, the discussion sections that are associated with that class might be a mix of both in-person and remote discussion sections to accommodate students for which the remote environment might work better for various reasons, and if it makes sense pedagogically. For fall planning, this was done way back in the spring when we were trying to look pretty far ahead to imagine what our situation was going to be like in the fall and taking a guess about how to carry out instruction safely in person. And so in the fall, we developed a number of recommendations for faculty to use when thinking about planning their classes in the event that we may have either instructor or student absences, and how students can continue learning if they are in quarantine, perhaps not as in a situation where they might be significantly ill, but still not coming to class. What can they do to continue their learning during this kind of period? And also, we had to plan for what would happen if instructors might be absent for the same reason, either symptomless or in fact illness that prevents them from coming to in-person classes. And so these are a few of the things that have happened during the fall and will likely continue through the winter. And it really, I think the key word here is flexibility. The Academic Senate, the COVID Response Recovery Task Force, the administration have all encouraged instructors to be flexible with respect to absences. If students are unable to come to class, are there ways that they can make up any attendance requirements that might be in place, or perhaps even there may not be attendance requirements for a particular class? Can there be flexibility around what assignments and exams instructors are offering? And potentially, can they audio or video record their lectures for any students that might be unable to attend class? We also made plans for instructor absences to allow instructors to shift their class to remote up to 2 sequential class periods in a row without some further authorization. So for example, if an instructor had close contact, they think they might have been exposed to COVID, they can switch to a remote class for up to 2 class periods. But if they're going to be absent from class for a longer period of time in order to maintain the in-person aspect of an in-person class, that would require approval by their department chair and or the dean. And we did encourage chairs and deans to consider contingency plans for absences ahead of time, because if an instructor falls ill, we'd like to be able to continue offering that class. And if they can have another instructor who could step in, that would be the best possible scenario. And some great developments in the area of technology in the classroom. So there's been a huge push over the last few months to equip our classrooms with technology to allow Bruincast audio, Bruincast video, and or Zoom streaming in the classrooms. So for example, one of the pictures that you see here, this is one of the large lecture halls on campus. This is Lacrette's 110. It can hold about 350 people, but it's equipped with Bruincast audio, Bruincast video, and Zoom streaming. So what's not shown here, there are 2 pull down screens. You can simultaneously have a screen that projects a lecture. It can project a person, the camera could be on a person, and can capture audio from the students in the room. And so this has been very helpful in trying to navigate for some classes, whether these lectures can be made available in some format for students who are unable to attend classes. Next slide, please, Michael. Thank you. And the good news about research operations, you probably recall a year ago, we were struggling with having our research operations continue on campus. Earlier in 2020, For example, laboratory research was entirely shut down. The libraries were closed. And the good news is we've moved back to a time now where we are operating as normal with no density restrictions in the lab. That's a relief to me. I do run a research lab, and it's nice to have people back in there able to interact with each other and push the research forward. And the libraries have recently reopened, which is fantastic for all the scholars that need the material that's there. So what have we learned? Well, the really good news is that in-person teaching can continue in a relatively safe manner. Michael had mentioned a number of the mitigations that we've put in place. We think they're working pretty well based on the low positivity rates we have on campus. Masks are extremely effective. We don't have any known cases of classroom spread of COVID-19 and no classroom outbreaks, which is fantastic. We were it's really glad to hear. Some things that we still do need to exercise caution about are social activities. Could be taking place, for example, off campus without masks. This seems to be where we have spread and outbreaks primarily occurring. Where does this leave us in the future? Well, looking forward, what can we do? You know, there are some people that very much like the remote environment, and I think we need to continue to think about what's the right mix that we should have for good educational practices. What's the right mix of in-person and remote classes? I think the answer is not going to be easy. It's going to depend on what the subject matter is, of course, potentially the class size. You know, one possible scenario is that large lecture classes could be remote or hybrid, but things that are smaller and more interactive might be taught in person. So, oh, Michael, there's your FlexWorks slide. We've already covered this one, but the good news about FlexWork is that 90% of employees were as or more productive working remotely. Only 10% perhaps were less productive. So that's been working out quite well.
I just want to thank you both. And don't we just love it when those slides pop up in places when we didn't expect them, right? That happens to me often. So I just want to thank you both so much for joining us tonight. And I have to say, as a as a faculty member, someone who's teaching on the campus right now, I had the opportunity to take my COVID test last Wednesday in one of the vending machines, and it's really easy. Like this is, I mean, it's incredibly efficient. It's a really thoughtful process. The results came within 24 hours. It was just, I mean, kudos to all of you and the incredible work you're doing. You know, I also want to acknowledge that the clearance portal is a godsend, right? It's actually incredibly helpful to, folk receive reminders. Actually, one of the things that you all didn't emphasize yet was that faculty members, people that are supposed to be on the campus, receive email reminders in the morning to help them know and remind them to fill out their COVID clearance survey so that you can identify where you're going to be. And it's interactive too. It has the map, it has all kinds of things. So I just want to thank you all for such thoughtful work, and the IT folk, right, who are engaged in these efforts to keep us going. I mean, they're in many ways unsung heroes in this moment. So for both of you, you know, UCLA has been working really hard to keep faculty, students, staff safe. So can you talk to us a bit more about what some of those safeguards are? I know you talked earlier about testing the wastewater, which I thought was incredible. I hadn't even heard of that idea. That's incredible. What are some of the other ways the university is working to keep our students, faculty, and staff safe? And visitors, for that, and alumni, really, yeah.
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, it's been an evolving sort of process over the entire pandemic as we learned. You know, we started with the sort of physical distancing piece, and we went through an entire process of understanding how we could teach courses where everybody was 6 feet away from each other, really dramatically impacting our ability to be able to accommodate all of our students. Basically leaves us with about 20 to 25% occupancy in all of our classrooms. Fortunately, that has gone away as we've learned more about the virus and how it spread. And so we've been able to allow more freedoms associated with, sort of social interactions with individuals, as well as how we operate on the campus. And right now, you know, a combination, I think, between really sort of the people being alert, wearing face coverings while they're in the classroom setting in particular is shown to be incredibly effective, where it's not just UCLA that doesn't seem to have any classroom spread associated with that environment. Other campuses like USC and Berkeley and other UC campuses that we're in close contact with have the same sort of findings that they're realizing. And it's just and then people just being diligent about making sure that when we have positive cases, because we know we're going to have them, is that we're quickly following up with them. So as soon as we have a positive case, the individual is notified, they're put into isolation either in a space where they're able to do that in their own living environment, or we will accommodate them in our spaces. We provide meals to them to make sure that they don't have to leave their room environment and potentially expose others. And then we quickly identify the individuals that were in close contact with that individual and put them in what's called quarantine, and then quickly test them in an effort to make sure that we don't create these secondary and tertiary spreads associated with a single case, which we would normally call case zero. So that's probably been the most effective, is recognizing the fact that you're actually going to continue to see positive COVID cases because it's very much alive in our community, but trying to really minimize the spread that exists from an individual case. And so I think those are the most effective efforts that we've undertaken and seen the value of. Megan, I'm not sure if you want to add more to that.
I'll just jump in quickly to say, I mean, it takes the community to keep the community safe. Yeah. And I have to say how happy I am to see that the vast majority of students are complying with wearing their masks when they're indoors. It's been remarkable. We did worry about, was it going to be a hard thing to enforce? And it really has not been a serious issue that we've had to address. So, masking and the vaccinations, I think, are huge. Plus all the other things that kind of go on behind the scenes, like wastewater testing that Michael mentioned. There's a lot that's going on that not everybody sees, but the most visible of them is mask wearing. And I have to say that compliance has been fantastic, and thanking the community for that.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think our students have done an incredible job maintaining safety. I walk around on campus and I see, for those of you that don't have the benefit right now of physically coming to our campus, we walk around and we see people wearing masks, on a regular basis, right? I think folk really take both the science and seriously, but they also take the appropriate precautions to ensure that they maintain their safety and that of others. Let me ask, with the COVID clearance requirements, how frequently do students, staff, or faculty need to complete them? Is it every day? Is it when they're present? What is the frequency with which they need to complete those COVID clearances?
So technically, it's every day that they're on the campus facility, on the campus environment. So if you're living in a campus facility, it would be every day. And if you're taking courses on a Tuesday, Thursday, then it would be on a Tuesday, Thursday, and so that's the intent associated with it. Otherwise, it's important for us to know and be able to render some public health assessment if in fact they do have symptoms. But it does enable us to be able to support the students, faculty, and staff if in fact they become symptomatic.
Incredible. So let's shift gears here a bit. I mean, we've talked about what you're doing administratively to help manage the impact of the pandemic upon our campus community. But what did you all learn from the pandemic experience that you believe can help sort of prepare us to be more nimble and respond to potential unforeseen future circumstances?
I'll start out. I mean, you mentioned the word nimble, and that word has been tossed around a lot because we were pretty impressed, I think, last winter, March 20, that we were able to pivot and change plans so quickly and still educate our students, and then move forward under relatively short notice to conduct classes even last spring. And all through last year then, there have been continuing challenges about how do we design assessments that we can we'll fairly assess our students in a remote environment. That's an ongoing challenge, but I think we're learning as we go. How can we support students that may have more challenges than they usually do? There are all kinds of lessons, from the academic side, thinking about how we do instruction, what's important for our students. I think that we need to gather data from what we've done over the last year and make some comparisons to be able to put it together. I mean, UCLA is not the only one that's doing this, but we of course have to think carefully then again about what it means for the future. I'll stop there. Michael, do you want to add?
I would add just one additional comment, which is, we've talked about the benefits of remote work, and there's a lot of discussion about that, and there's questions about what the future of education looks like. But I can say that our students are sort of voting with their feet. They want to be here physically on campus. They want to be living in campus housing, and they want to be participating in campus activities. They are excited to be back on campus, and I don't think that that's fundamentally going to change in the future. It's part of the educational experience is to physically be here and enjoy the beauty and the camaraderie and the extracurricular activities and the engagement with faculty and other students. So I think that is something that's going to continue, even if other things become more remote in our society.
Yeah, agreed. I think I notice a lot of my students are just incredibly grateful to be back. I think on the first day of class, we said, folk applauded that we were back in person, and that they were excited to be in person. So that actually brings up a question for you, Megan, which is about the experience of faculty. I mean, what has that been like? This idea of needing to adjust to remote teaching and then coming back to person, or even being in the classroom where all, including faculty, are wearing masks. I'm telling you, talking through that mask in a classroom with a group of 100 students is not an easy feat. I can tell you that right now. So what have you been hearing from faculty?
I think faculty share the excitement for the most part of the students and happy to be back because we feed off the excitement of the students. And for the most part, it's really positive energy we've been feeling. And so it is invigorating to be back. I'm teaching an in-person class this term. It's a small class, but it's still been challenging, and there are still things that I'm getting used to. So I have, the group of students that are in person, and occasionally I have had students that have been not unable to attend. So we're only just finished, we're starting week 4. I've recorded a couple lectures. I tried doing a hybrid class where I tried to engage a student through the computer as well as engaging the students that are in person. And it was challenging because of there were technical reasons, but also just ensuring that everybody has an equal voice and can speak up. There were things that need to be worked through. And I think we're all learning as we go. It's nice to be challenged. But overall, I think I hear quite positive things from faculty that, we had anticipated there would be a lot of problems. And thankfully, many of those problems are not turning out to be things that are realized. So, we planned for the worst and hoped for the best. And we're doing pretty well. And that's been really, again, wonderful to experience. So, yeah, it's been mostly good, mostly positive.
Well, that's incredible. I do think faculty are doing an incredible job in their best to adjust. I've also had students that have had to miss the class, and I can tell you, if they have a sniffle, right, they don't get cleared. I mean, obviously this relies upon us being compliant and supporting each other, but being as flexible as possible is really, really, really important. One of the things that folk in our audience are asking about, and this can go to either of you, is what happens, when students have to face quarantine, or they are testing, or they are positive. Let's say there's a student who doesn't live on campus, a student who is, in an apartment off campus and tests positive. Then what? Like, how does the university provide support? Do they quarantine in their space? Is there a different location those students who are not positive can stay? What do you do for those off-campus students?
So it's very similar. We first reach out with them and make sure that they how they're feeling and see if they need any medical attention. And then it's an assessment. We don't require them to move to our isolation quarantine facilities, but we do remind them that it's important that they do that so they don't spread the virus to family members or roommates, and give them the option of where they are most comfortable. So if they're most comfortable and they're able to isolate or quarantine in their apartment or in their home, then they tend to do that. And if they're not able to do so, then we are able to accommodate them on the campus. We don't actually charge them for the space, even if they're not living with us. We would only charge them for the meals that we provide for them. And we do try to provide the full wraparound services to them while they're in the isolation and quarantine space, because they are alone. They're in a room, for the most part, they're in the guest house in a hotel room by themselves. And so we make sure that they're getting the support they need for school, any mental health assistance that they need, as well as food and any medical attention they might need.
Yeah, that's incredible. I think, in considering when students have to isolate, there's also questions to your point, Megan, earlier about how faculty members are trying to navigate that, right? I know not every room is equipped to provide sort of, remote instruction. So trying to operate a hybrid classroom where it's partially, I had my daughter's elementary school was like that, where some parents we opted for her to be remote, and then some parents opted for their children to be back in person, and the teachers are trying to figure that out. I know our faculty members are trying to figure that out. One of the questions that came in from one of our folk in the audience is, what happens if a professor doesn't allow for Zoom attendance, for students because they weren't cleared, right? Is that fair that student is not able to access the class materials if they're not able to attend because they weren't cleared?
Yeah, it's actually a really tough question and a good one. We have encouraged faculty to be as flexible as possible when planning their instruction. So it might be that attendance isn't required, or again, we encourage faculty, if it makes sense for their course, to record it and make it available to students who are absent. It's a tricky issue, but what we need to remember too is that faculty deal every year with students who are absent for various reasons. There could be a bad flu season. There can be, just numerous other problems that prevent students from coming to campus. And we usually figure it out on an individual basis how to navigate those absences, and hopefully the student can continue their learning. And so, with all the encouragement that we've given to faculty to help think about how to make a course that will still help a student succeed, perhaps in different ways than was originally planned, but thinking about contingency plans for what might happen, we strongly encourage for faculty, and hopefully they can figure it out individually for each student in ways that will support the students.
Incredible. Thank you all so much. So, here's one of the biggest questions. There are some staff that have an opportunity to work remotely. Their jobs make it possible and easy for them to do that. And there are others who can't. How do you address those issues, right? If you're in a service category on campus, for example, where you need to be present, how are you addressing issues related to equity amongst employees?
I'd say that's a really tough and poignant question, because there are a number of employees, particularly in food service or custodial or any of the skilled trades, that their work isn't, it's not possible to clean a classroom or prepare food in a remote environment. And so we're trying to go through that now and understand how we can create greater fairness, because clearly individuals who are able to work in a remote environment, right, they're not paying for gas and car maintenance, and their insurances goes down. They don't have to pay for parking. They have certainly a lot more time not having to go through the commute. And those that are needing to work on campus have exactly, the opposite of that. They still have a commute. They still have all those costs associated with coming to work in person, including parking. And so this is a question I wish I had an answer to, but it is something that we clearly are cognizant of and trying to figure out what the right balance is in being able to encourage and support individuals from being able to work remotely that can, and then also acknowledging that there are certain employees that their job is not conducive to a remote environment, and how do we create a fairness in that situation?
I really appreciate that. And that actually, I think, dovetails very nicely into a question that's coming from some of our folk in the audience, which is, if staff are allowed to work remotely, then what about students who like to opt to do the same? Is there a protocol that will allow them to study remotely, to participate remotely?
Yeah, that's again a tough question, and I think we're trying to figure out right now what the right mix of remote versus in person and what impact either instructional modality might have on learning. Obviously, the best case scenario is we can be effective at reaching our students and give them a valuable educational experience, but we need to figure out exactly how to do that. And it's going to be different for different courses and probably different for different people, but how can we do the best job by all our students? And there isn't really an easy answer that I can give to that at this point, unfortunately.
No, really appreciate that. I think what I hear you saying is that if we remain student centered, think about how we can facilitate effective student learning, then those answers will come. But right now, this is one of the best ways we can do it. I should also add that often the requirements for our university are such that, and across the board are such that in-person learning was the primary modality, right? So I think the COVID protocols and the governor's emergency orders and the university's emergency orders and the Department of Public Health's emergency orders suspended a lot of those, or at least required a different response so that we can continue to deliver, teaching and instruction in whatever modality we could. But that doesn't always work for everybody, especially for students with who may be, have additional needs, who may need additional accommodations, that may not be able to access slides on a computer, right? There are students who may have different challenges with a specific modality, and in-person instruction might help those students navigate even better. So I think it's important to note that it's what I hear you saying is that it's really based upon student learning and student learning needs. So, one of the things that has come up is a question around large-scale events. How is the campus navigating and or managing those? How are you going to help, with our upcoming family weekend, for example? How are you going to navigate thousands of people coming to the campus, or our athletic events, or even what are the expectations when the players are on the court, for example, in poly, and they're not wearing masks, but then you ask the audience to wear the mask? I know these are some really interesting questions, but these are inquiring minds would like to know, right? So how do you navigate these large events, maintaining these safety protocols, but then also still allowing for, different protocols for different groups?
We'll start with the easiest one, which is the issue associated with players not wearing a mask and everybody else wearing a mask, because the way that the virus is either through particulate droplet or aerosol disperses very quickly. So, and then reduces so if you're on the court, there's certainly a lot less density than if you're sitting next to or surrounded by, let's say, a dozen people that are within maybe 6 feet of you. Now, certainly when it aerosols, it can travel farther than the 6 feet, but that's where the ventilation comes into play. So we can actually make the court a relatively safe environment, and also recognizing the fact that everybody on the court is being tested, is vaccinated, is right on and on and on. And so we're reducing the risk there. Under the current requirements under the city of LA and the county of LA, it's a very different model that we're going to be implementing for the basketball games coming up, because individuals need to be either fully vaccinated and be able to demonstrate that they are, or they need to have had a negative test within the last 72 hours. And we're going to have to check all of that and verify that against their driver's license or some type of photo ID as they enter the facility. And so you can think about it from a logistic perspective. It's already difficult with lines getting into the facilities, and how do you manage it? So it's going to add complexity, which is why we're working on the clearance portal, so that any student, faculty, or staff who's on the campus could actually just simply flash their clearance certificate, and be able to be cleared without having to go through the same level of complexity. So that'll help us manage it. The other thing that's very interesting is the issue associated with eating, and we certainly associate sporting events with eating and drinking. And just to be quite honest, we're not entirely sure how that works. For a basketball game, are you going to be able to eat in your seat? Are you going to have to eat in the concourse? So they're going to have, it's not clear at the moment how that's going to be managed. Certainly at the Rose Bowl, where it's outdoors, there are no restrictions, of course, for eating in your seat, and you're supposed to be wearing a face mask. But I would say that there's very little compliance in outdoor sporting events associated with mask wearing. I had the opportunity to go to SoFi Stadium a couple of weeks ago, and there were certainly people wearing masks, but it was a very small minority of individuals doing that. So there's going to be a lot of complexity, and so we ask for a lot of patience as people attend events. And from the campus environment, again, it's just making sure that people aren't coming who are sick, and that they're testing if they are sick, so they know if they have hay fever or whether or not they actually have COVID or some other contagious disease that they may have.
That's a really interesting question, Michael, about compliance, because one of the questions that came in is, well, what if a student or someone doesn't want to miss a class, or they don't want to have to quarantine, or they're not gonna comply, they're not trying to comply, right? So they conceal their their symptoms and go to class anyway. I mean, how obviously with the positivity rate being so low, right? We're not seeing, I think, maybe as much of that. So I think the data speaks for itself. But what can be done? Is there anything that can be done in those cases?
So students that are not compliant do go through student conduct, and it depends on the severity of the situation. And so we had a situation recently that we had misinterpreted. So the good news is it wasn't what I'm going to describe, but it was more or less what you were describing, which is a student who had knowingly was sick and had tested positive, was attending a class. Now remember, this didn't happen, so I'll keep repeating this. This didn't happen, but we thought that's what was happening. So the student was actually a TA, and so we were actually processing a dismissal because they were flagrantly disregarding the health and safety of their students by coming to a class and teaching. Now, I'll say it again, this was not the case. In fact, they never, once they were once they were symptomatic, they didn't go to class, and they took the test and they were positive, and they never returned to the class. And so they did exactly what they were supposed to do. The information got misconstrued, but it gives an opportunity to explain what the options are available to the campus and why we take it seriously, because it goes back to what Megan talked about before. It's not just your individual health, it's the risks that you're creating your fellow students or faculty in the environment, and it takes the entire community to want to be supportive of the Bruin community and effort for this to work. And at the moment that works, but if people decide that they're not going to comply and put their fellow students or campus community at risk, then the campus actually does need to respond in an appropriate manner so that the parents of those students and the students themselves know that the campus is managing the pandemic in an appropriate manner.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that and really allowing us to have a deeper understanding. Folks, again, if you're joining us, welcome to the first town hall of our academic year. I am your UCLA Alumni Association President, D'Artagnan Scorza, joined by UCLA's Administrative Vice Chancellor, Michael Beck, and UCLA's Professor Megan McEvoy in both the Institute for Society and Genetics and the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Molecular Genetics. Megan, I'm going to toss this, we're coming up on time here, but I really want to see if I can get a couple of questions in for you that are related to the culture of higher education as well as the field of microbiology. So the first one for you is, how do you think higher ed has changed given the pandemic?
You didn't want to hit me with a hard question, did you? How do I think the culture of higher education has changed? I'm not sure I have a great answer to that. I mean, again, it harkens back to some of the things I was thinking about earlier. Thinking about different learning modalities, learning experiences, what is effective, how can we work together, how can we be flexible? I mean, I think those things are changing. Right? I mean, you can look at education even over the past 100 years, and it used to be somebody stood up in front of a class, said a bunch of things, and walked away without taking questions. There's a lot more interaction that takes place in classrooms these days, right? And how do we best foster interactions that build a learning community? So those are still, it's in flux now. And we've done a grand experiment on the fly that, we all started teaching remotely, really without training to do it. And, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? Are still things that we are thinking about. So.
It's incredible. Now, what about the field of microbiology? I mean, what advances have occurred as a result of this? I mean, they say in every crisis there may be opportunities. So what are you seeing happen in the field? What are we learning?
With respect to specifically about COVID, or about, you mean like the research that I do, or?
Yeah, in your area of research.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not a virologist or an immunologist, so I really can't answer questions about COVID specifically. But thinking about how this has impacted sort of the research that I do, I mean, again, a lot of things have shifted that used to be in person to remote status. For example, reviewing grants for the NIH used to mean that I'd fly to Washington, D.C. 3 times a year to meet with people in person. Turns out that's something that we can pretty effectively do through a Zoom meeting, and then we don't have to, have the environmental cost of all of us getting on an airplane. It takes a whole lot less time. Meetings are conducted more efficiently. Conferences, though, research conferences where we get together with other people. I have to say, personally, I'm pretty tired of Zoom lectures and Zoom meetings myself. I prefer to get together with people to not only hear about the science that they're doing, but have a chance to sit at a dinner table and have all those conversations that take place sort of outside of just hearing the information about the research. So that's been sort of difficult to navigate, and that's still something that's ramping up. The first scientific conference I was going to attend was going to be next week, and I ended up having to cancel that, but that would have been the first in the last year and a half. And so that's been, again, there's an impact on the research that we do. Productivity has slowed. I think there's lots of studies that have showed that we're not publishing papers at the same kind of rates that we used to. It's a little harder to get supplies. I know that when we order things for our labs, there's delays in getting them. I'm not training students at the same rate, and that's in part because of the physical distancing that resulted from undergraduate trainees need to have close contact so they can learn the laboratory techniques safely. And when that couldn't happen, I unfortunately had to say, I'm sorry, I can't accept more students in my lab. And so it was only the trained ones that could work individually that were there. We have to go back to, and there are lots of labs that are now doing this pretty effectively, is getting students back in. I don't know whether that's yet returned to the same pace of research trainees that we had pre-COVID, but let's hope it does so.
Incredible. Well, before we end, I'll ask you in less than a minute to maybe share, both of you, what is the top lesson that you believe you've learned as a result of, this COVID-19 pandemic, especially as it relates to UCLA, but you can also share one personally. What's the top lesson you've learned?
I'm going to use the words that you've already heard, that we can be nimble and flexible, that we have more to draw from than I think we realized. And, you know, I'm not too old to learn new tricks, and neither are a lot of other people, that we can adapt. And I think we're doing pretty well. So
Incredible. Thank you so much for sharing that.
I'll say I can sort of sum it up as, you know, before the pandemic, we were looking at buying another high-rise office building on Wilshire Boulevard. And so we jokingly now say, you know, post-pandemic, we'll be looking to sell one of our office buildings on Wilshire Boulevard. It's really transformed the way in which we do work. And, you know, in the past, we really looked at everything, even back office operations, needed to be done physically on campus. And that's clearly not the case. And I think we proved that quite effectively with for a number, particularly for administrative functions, that they can be done remotely. And the things that Megan mentioned about, you know, the reduction in travel, or you think about, from an administrative perspective, how many meetings we went to the Office of the President for, how many of those meetings can now be conducted in a remote environment? There's still going to be in-person meetings. Nothing beats an in-person meeting, but I think you're going to really question whether everybody needs to be jumping on a plane every time, or whether that could be split. And I think in the very similar to, I think, what you're going to see the consulting world is, you know, they would go out every single week to meet with a client, and it could be that they can do those check-ins every month or quarterly in person, and otherwise be done in a Zoom environment. And I think that's going to transform how we do work. But it also provides us an opportunity on the campus to look at how we might transform office space that was used for offices that could become study space, additional classroom space. So we might be able to expand the student capacity of UCLA without actually building another building.
That's incredible. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you both tonight for being here, and for our guests. I want to let you know that we have a very, very special individual joining us in November as well, and we want you to look for that announcement as well as the date. Will be coming out here in the very near future. We welcome your ideas about topics we can cover, maybe topics we can explore here in our not only alumni world, but in our UCLA universe. I want to thank our guest tonight, UCLA's Administrative Vice Chancellor Michael Beck, and also Professor Megan McEvoy, for joining us and having such a robust conversation about our return to campus here this fall. We welcome you all back, and we thank you so much again for being a part of our incredible UCLA community. Have a wonderful evening tonight, folk, and go Bruins.